Welcome back. Thank you very much for staying with us. So what are the biggest risks facing the world? Well, the World Economic Forum's latest global risk report identifies that in the next 2 years, the cost of living crisis will be the biggest risk. Over the next 10 years, environmental risks will be most prominent. The forum is warning that multiple shocks are converging to rock the globe in the next decade. Where does this leave South Africa and the continent? What should South Africa prepare for? To help us make sense of this report, I'm joined by Africa analyst Koffi Kwaku. He's a senior researcher at the Center for Africa-China Studies at the University of Johannesburg. Professor Kwaku, good morning and thank you very much for your time. I must say it's a very interesting and worrying report presenting both new and old risks. But let's start with the returning or old risk of a high cost of living, which has been identified as the most severe threat facing us over the next 2 years, although South Africans would say they're already facing it. But just take us through what, in your view, have been the contributing factors that brought us to this moment where cost of living is a severe threat.
Well, first of all, good morning and good morning to all your viewers. Risks, really old risks, haven't changed much. It's that our focus is back on them, and the effect is much sharper than what they used to be. So a risk by itself, it's a chance that something happening will have a sort of negative effect. And your risk may not be my risk, but those global risks are really important, especially on the inflationary side. And then these old risks about the expense and the cost of life. And I would say very quickly that one of the reasons today is we will find it that the war in Ukraine has had a huge impact on the kind of global risk we have, because it has what's called cascading risk factor across the board on almost everything, being uncertainty, insecurity, potential for a world war that is out there. So people are evaluating risk with the fear. So there's a lot of hogging of resources. Hence, when you hog the resources, prices will go up. And some of the prices that went up were coming from the prices of the consequential cost of oil, for example, but also food prices, wheat, and so forth. So those kind of costs and risks have had an enormous amount of impact on the kind of cost of living we have. I think the next 2 to 3 years, I would agree with that. I think it's a good projection. And for South Africa, there will be, we're feeling it already with the past 3 years, with the restriction of COVID-19, lockdown, and so forth. It is a very, very powerful but painful sort of effect of these risks.
And with us in South Africa, there's also our own internal dynamics, particularly around energy security, which is a big problem. So we're certainly going to experience a greater risk this time around in the next 2 years. But then another of the short-term risks is natural disasters or extreme weather events, which we've also started to experience, though not at a level of other nations, but most certainly extreme for South Africa. What are your views on this one being a second risk, second most highest?
I think they're very important. The evidence has already shown to us that the past 10 to even 20 years, the kind of extreme events that we've had, especially in the in KwaZulu-Natal area, and then on the eastern coast of the country, show that we need to be prepared. And if we're not prepared, if we can't anticipate these kind of risks and do something about them, the consequences will be very, very sadly felt by us. But one thing is, we must say that risk have always been with the world. The history of risk shows that what is more important is not the way we perceive the risk, but how we deal with it in a way that the policy responses are more important than the risks themselves.
Yes.
Understanding them, evaluating them, assessing them, but also acting. Not just wait for the effect of the risk to show up, but to anticipate as possible. So there are new sciences of anticipatory sciences that are developed, but also things like scenario planning that are showing up, that telling leaders that, my goodness, do something, prepare quickly, organize sewage, organize water issues, but be ready, before those risks really happen. For me, overall, if I look at the global risk of the World Economic Forum, one risk that for me is missing is what I call hubristic leadership. which means the role of leaders to be less arrogant and make decisions that will take the world into a very different path, especially war that we're seeing today in Ukraine. And that's the missing risk, the global risk that I think should have been added to it. Although the World Economic Forum report writers will say that this is sort of a cross-cutting risk that's embedded in it. But I would have wanted that to be
more pronounced. Yeah, and when reading the report, I saw they suggested, though, that the new era or new crop of leaders or policymakers are themselves a risk, in that when you look at just these old risks, they might be unfamiliar with these old risks, so not necessarily dispense with them appropriately. So was that perhaps not tackling the leadership risk that exists right now?
Yes, they did, but it was sort of subdued within the report. What we want to have is to make it visible. And by making it visible, it takes, very powerful, if you want, elements so that we understand that the leaders are very important in any kind of risk management. And if we have poor leadership, there will be a consequential effect, making the risk even greater, and then the impact of the risk even worse.
Now, the third highest risk is geo-economic confrontations. China and the US's trade war comes to mind immediately, a clear case where disputes are settled through weapons of commerce. Your views on this one? Do you see it just being on the rise at this point?
Yes, indeed. I think they flagged it out very well. It's not a matter of perception. The evidence is showing that the aggression, the belligerence, and then the sort of call to war, especially from the US-led West, is putting a great deal of pressure on the world. And then by itself, it's a great risk. And if the US and then its allies continue to pressure China and Russia, the way we've seen it funding toward the war to a tune of more than $100 billion, this will continue to get the risk much, much higher for all of us. And the risk is not just a simple war, a nuclear war with what's the World Wealth Organization called holy crisis that could mushroom all over the place. And in fact, Africa could be a theater of war, of that kind of confrontation. And this is a big risk. We need to pay attention. I think the World Economic Forum